And without further ado, I would like to welcome Marilyn Chase to Silent Book Club tonight. Marilyn is a journalist with the Wall Street Journal. She's also a professor at UC Berkeley at the Graduate School of Journalism. She is a Stanford grad, which I won't hold against her as a Berkeley grad because she also has a master from Berkeley, so we are okay. Marilyn's first book was The Barbary Plague, which was all about the Black Death in San Francisco. Due to current events, at the end of the hour, we may sneak in a couple of questions about that book because it's a little bit relevant. But we are here today to talk about Ruth Asawa and her amazing life and her amazing work. And so, Marilyn, welcome.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Guinevere and Laura for inviting me to this amazing network of readers and for reminding us all of the pleasure and comfort that reading can give us, especially at a time like this. Just a word about my background. After Stanford and Berkeley, I did become a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for about 30 years, actually, but I no longer am there. I am principally teaching at UC Berkeley. I visited as an instructor at Stanford for a little bit. But once I discovered the joy of writing books, I have to say that's kind of become my holy grail. And my output is small because I tend to pick very uncommercial subjects, as agents and publishers have told me. However, except for the goddesses of this particular work, Carrie Hannigan of HG Literary and Bridget Watson-Payne and Mirabelle Korn from Chronicle Books. Happily, they became as intrigued with Ruth Asawa's story as I was. So like many of you, I probably fell in love with writing in primary school. I wrote for my elementary school newspaper. The year I turned 16, I was editor-in-chief of my newspaper and was probably preoccupied with whether or not I would get invited to the prom. And that was not Ruth Asawa's story. As some of you know, she was born on a truck farm, delivered by a midwife in a tiny farm house that her father built with his own hands, straightened and reused every nail. She grew up in poverty. She knew hard toil. When she wasn't in school or doing homework, she was out in the fields, preparing the soil, working the dirt, planting the seeds, harvesting the crops, helping her father take them to market. So she had a way of turning adversity into opportunity, whether it was the Depression era childhood, whether it was World War II, whether it was incarceration, whether it was being denied her teaching credential by the teachers' college she attended. She found a way to get past it, transcend it, and turn it into an opportunity to ultimately realize her real dream, which was making art. So I wanted to read you just a little bit, perhaps to spark a little curiosity, from the very opening of the book. It's the prologue, entitled Auction 2013. It's a little bit of a flash forward after her very long and eventful life. When the auctioneer's hammer came down, the winning bid topped $1.4 million for an 11-foot-long sculpture of wire mesh so light that its shadow and substance seemed to merge. The delicacy was deceptive. Years of weaving such wire into gossamer globes had scarred the artist's small hands. Christie's May 2013 show, Ruth Asawa, Objects and Apparitions, was the sculptor's first solo exhibition in New York City in over 50 years. The evening auction at Rockefeller Plaza fetched 4 to 5 times the sculpture's estimated value of $250,000 to $350,000. Some people in the San Francisco gallery world had worried about putting Ruth's pieces on the block where they could disappear into private hands out of public view. She belonged in galleries and museums that would display and not disperse her work, they said, but on the New York art market, it was a triumph. The record auction price for an Asawa vaulted the artist into the stratosphere. Christie's senior specialist of post-war and contemporary art, Jonathan Labe, was elated and convinced that Ruth's resurgence was underway. Ruth's children, raised to put creativity over commerce, were stunned. This was Mom's work, one of many pieces she wove in her home studio, where her children also saw her cooking dinners and mopping floors. For as long as they could remember, her sculptures had hung from the rafters, sheltering their lives, casting moving shadows. Watching the act of making sculpture had expanded their world beyond the brown shingled house where they grew up in San Francisco into limitless realms of art. So far from the frenzied bidding at Rockefeller Center, the artist kept a lookout over her garden, a profusion of green she tended for most of her 87 years. She watched the windows for the emerald flash of hummingbirds that sipped nectar and wove nests in her honeysuckle. She had survived the Great Depression and World War II, slighted for her gender and interned for her race. She had toiled in the fields, the studio, and the classroom, elevating work to a form of Zen practice, her hands never still. Now, arthritis had stiffened her once agile fingers. Fragile from strokes, she had spoken little in the 6 years since losing her life partner, the architect Albert Lanier. Together, they had lived without a blueprint and loved across color lines. They raised 6 children and fought for the education of thousands more. They mastered the art of shaping space, Ruth in sculpture and Albert in architecture. As their health failed, the couple had lived in hospital beds in the sunny room that had once been her studio. Her children knew best how to deliver the big news from the auction and how to read her response. Innocent of the previous night's bidding, Ruth looked bemused as her daughters Aiko and Addie drew close. When Addie whispered the sales figure in her mother's ear, Aiko watched her mother's eyes and mouth widen in wonder as if to say, "Really?" "Mama," Addie said, "you're playing with the big boys now." But it had not always been so. And that's the prologue. That launches us into Ruth's life.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I love that anecdote and how well you bring it to life with the green flash of the hummingbird and Ruth in bed and her daughters tiptoeing up. It really it captures so much of, I think, what this book does really well, which is painting the landscape from which Ruth emerged. It's funny. So I have a degree in art history, and I am so used to art criticism talking about the work and about the context of the work within the larger art world and art market, and influences and this and that. And what I personally enjoyed most about your book is that it really focuses on the woman and on all of the different influences in her life that fed her art, but also how much she gave back outside of the pieces themselves. So I'd love to kind of kick things off a little bit with just some of the backstory about what interested you in Ruth Asawa, what brought you to her work, and how did you, as a journalist, begin writing about an artist?
Well, that's a great way to begin the discussion, because unlike you, Guinevere, I am not an art historian. I am not a curator. And so I had to come to this subject with all the humility I could muster as a generalist. But I was hooked from the first moment that I think I was reading online some news sites, and it was the summer of 2014. I was looking for my next big project. And I learned that the Asawa Lanier family, Ruth's children, had given her papers to Stanford University. And it turned out there were 275 boxes of papers. And this included, of course, letters and documents and photos and designs, contracts and diaries, even message pads from the phone stand in her house. Everything, all the little bits and pieces that make up the mosaic of a life well lived. And I was just hooked. And the more that I read about her story and the extraordinary life that she lived and the adversities that she overcame, I really felt that more and more as time has gone by, she's a hero for our time. And the struggle, although she made it look easy, the struggle that she went through to overcome racial and gender bias to get her work noticed gives us great lessons for today, as well as hope, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the relevance now when you look at her in the context of, you know, the people who she studied with at Black Mountain College, and the sort of delayed appreciation that a lot of women artists are getting, sort of, you know, after their time. That really struck me, you know, with that line in the prologue about playing with the big boys, because I mean, she, you know, first of all, it's just amazing when you read about her trajectory from going from a Japanese internment camp to a teacher's college in Wisconsin, and then arriving at Black Mountain College, where she's studying with Josef Albers, and, you know, and her peer group of the student body includes Robert Rauschenberg, and, you know, and Buckminster Fuller becomes a friend. I mean, the social circle and that peer group in the 1940s and 50s is amazing. Can you talk a little bit about you know, her time at Black Mountain, and also how those influences sort of helped her become the artist that she did become?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, and we've covered many decades in that question. So let me see if I can pick up the thread. So when a young artist to be is ordered to prison at the age of 16, the year when we're just sort of developing our dreams and trying to picture our life to come, it's hard to even conceive of how she could have overcome it and emerged intact and healthy, much less filled with energy and creativity. So indeed, she was in a war relocation center, they called it, in Arkansas. First, her family was scooped up and ordered into Santa Anita Racetrack, where they were confined to a horse stable for about 6 months, and then put on an ancient, decrepit train for about 3 days and nights to Arkansas, where they lived in tar paper barracks. And she was only allowed to leave after she graduated from the camp high school, the prison camp high school, to attend college, and only if she remained in the Midwest. That was the deal. She could not return to either coast, particularly not the West Coast, which was deemed to be a militarily sensitive area. So she looked through course catalogs, decided that Chicago Art Institute was beyond her in terms of expense, and noticed that Milwaukee State Teachers College, which only charged $25 a semester, might be within her range if she worked as a nanny and a housekeeper and saved her money and got a scholarship. So off she went on a train by herself with her suitcase, her single suitcase. She bid goodbye to her mother, left her mother behind and her siblings in prison camp, and her father in another alien enemy camp, whom she wouldn't see until the end of the war, and went alone to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and entered Milwaukee State Teachers College, now a part of the University of Wisconsin. So she studied there. She actually liked the classes very much, but after 3 years of hard work and study and labor to meet expenses, she was denied her credential and the right to graduate because it was said no public school in Wisconsin would have her be a student teacher due to her race. The school framed it as an act they took for her protection, but in fact, it all boiled down to bias and lingering hostility and mistrust of Japanese American people. So that was 3 years lost. However, some of her good friends at Milwaukee said, come with us to Black Mountain College. There is this magical experimental art school. We're going. You have to come. You have to meet Josef Albers. You have to see all the wonderful work that's being done there. So she managed to find a scholarship, $200 that she thought would last her through a summer session. And once again, she got on a train for Asheville, North Carolina, and went to Black Mountain College, this unique sort of almost space-time event. It only lasted for about 2 decades, from, or say 3, from the late 30s through the mid to late 50s. And then it was gone. And it was a place that had no credentials. It was very free. It had no grades. It had no regular tests. So it gave no report cards except for transfer credits if that was required. But the students had to work, not only do their studio classes and work to produce art, but also work on the farm, because the farm fed the college. They had to plant crops, which she was used to from doing hard work on her parents' farm. She had to drive a converted weapons carrier to carry coal to the furnace and crops into the field and back. She swept floors. She made beds. She gave haircuts for 10 cents to the faculty and the students. She did all this work and her studio work, producing real art. And of course, she met the great mentor of her life, Josef Albers, the Bauhaus refugee painter and colorist, who became her great mentor. And the story goes, it's a great story. She wanted to take weaving from his wife, Annie Albers, that summer, but Annie said, "I'm sorry, I can't possibly teach you to weave in just 6 weeks." So she did the next best thing, which was to take color and design from Josef Albers. And that set her trajectory into art for life. She also met Buckminster Fuller, who became a great friend and mentor for life. Even in later years, came to visit her in San Francisco and go to the public schools and teach school children how to create geometric sculptures out of milk cartons. So these were truly dear friends. She also knew Rauschenberg and some of the artists who would go on to create the postmodern abstract expressionist school in New York. She met Susan Weil, briefly Rauschenberg's wife and the mother of his child. She knew John Cage and Merce Cunningham. So there was music, there was dance. And at Black Mountain, painters could write poetry and sculptors could perform modern dance or sing in the chorus. And she did all these things. She engaged in performance art. She performed in a production of The Rite of Spring, in which the students would run down a hill dressed in sort of loincloths and primitive outfits. And she said it was quite a sight to see Rauschenberg wearing a loincloth, wielding a torch and doing freeform dance. So it was full of experiments and energy, and it really was formative for her, and it set her on a course and set her belief, really, that the best way for young artists to learn is by working with working artists. So I hope that gives you some little taste of that.
I mean, it's really just amazing to just kind of picture the kind of creative energy that was concentrated in one place. But after Black Mountain, so she didn't move to New York to become an artist with a lot of this other cohort. Instead, she came to San Francisco. So how did that transition sort of take place? And was well, I'll gonna not make my questions loaded. I'm gonna stop.
Well, it's okay. I also ask questions with a long wind-up, so I totally understand. Basically, in a nutshell, she fell in love. She might well have wound up in New York, but the fact was she was going on a hike on a beautiful garden path above Black Mountain College in a spot called by the students the Garden of Eden. It was above Lake Eden, but it gives you a chance to sort of know the sort of sense of romance about the place. And she ran smack into a new student by the name of Albert Lanier, and he was a young man from Georgia. He was a World War II veteran, a year younger than Ruth, but had had a lot of experience. He'd studied architecture and engineering at Georgia Tech, but had come to Black Mountain to continue his studies of architecture. And when they met, neither of them had been much of a dater or had had much experience, but they had eyes only for each other. He also helped with her math homework, so there was a bonus. But he wrote his parents very quickly, his very conservative Georgia parents, who were pillars of their community, that he had met a Japanese American student who knew all about flowers, mother, as much as you do. And he then proceeded to describe in this glorious lyrical language the flowers they had seen together. And it's really a strong message to mother that this is not just any old classmate. This is a very special young woman. So Ruth and Albert became each other's staunchest supporters in art and in life. She advised him on the placement of every stone and piece of wood in a house he built for an architectural project on campus called Minimum House. If one stone was out of place, she would urge him to tear down the whole wall. He supported her painting and sculpture without reservation. And mind you, this is the 1940s, when we all in the 2000s think that it was a time of repression and rigid roles and so forth. But they completely threw away the rule book, and they were utterly equal partners in art and in love and in life. So when it came time to leave Black Mountain, they exchanged in a series of extraordinary love letters, which through the generosity of the family, I was able to read and share. They kind of worked it out. Where would they live? Where would they work? How could they be true to their art and to each other? Would they have a family? How large? And they negotiated every detail. And Albert went ahead to San Francisco to continue taking some courses in basic architecture and engineering. And they finally worked out that if they were going to be a couple, that San Francisco would be a good place for them because it was progressive, it was liberal, it was said to be a cheap place where young artists could live and get a loft and feed themselves and create their art and make a family. So San Francisco it was.
Well, I mean, we lucked out because you know, obviously she made a huge impact on this city. So they move out here, they get married, and you know, Ruth, in your book, you talk about how, you know, she always wanted to be an artist, and from, you know, studying with these Disney animators in the internment camp and learning how to draw all the way through. But she also always wanted to have a large family. And, you know, and I think that one of the most incredible and mind-blowing things about Asawa and her life and her work is that she managed to create this incredible body of work while also raising 6 children. And, you know, a number of our readers, you know, when they submitted questions, there were several questions, you know, asking how did she do it? You know, what was her work process, and how was she able to, you know, to be an artist, and also raise 6 children?
Well, from first principles, Ruth always wanted a large family. She had grown up as the middle child of 7 in her family of working farmers, poor, proud working farmers. And she grew up in this large, warm, crowded house. And she always knew that she wanted a large family. So that was one of the sort of conditions of her getting together with Albert, is that she knew she wanted 6. She came up with the number 6. And in fact, before they left Black Mountain, when they went to their mentors, as they were sort of negotiating their parental resistance, they ended up going to their dear mentors, Josef Albers and Buckminster Fuller, and asking for their blessing of their marriage. So as it happened, when Ruth went to see Josef Albers, she said, I want to have a family, but I also want to be an artist. Do you think it is even possible? And he said somewhat sternly, well, how many children do you want? And she said 6. She was so frightened. She couldn't raise her eyes to meet his. And he said something like, yeah, you make babies, that is your art. But just make sure they're Asawa's babies. As he told her once when she sort of tweaked him that she preferred painting flowers to abstracts like his, he said, yeah, just make sure they're Asawa's flowers. So she got Josef Albers' blessing, and Albert went to get Buckminster Fuller's blessing. And Buckminster Fuller said, wonderful. He was just unreserved in his enthusiasm. He was jubilant and so happy for them. He said, I'll make your wedding ring. And he said, the world is your oyster. You rub and make a big pearl. And so that was the blessing he sent them off with. Important to note that in between college and Black Mountain and the art studio that they built in San Francisco together, Ruth had made 2 pivotal trips to Mexico where she observed some craftspeople weaving wire baskets to take fruit and eggs and vegetables to market. And she observed the looping technique that they used. And she was taught this technique. And so when she returned to Black Mountain, she had been painting previously, and suddenly she was all on fire to begin looping wire. And one of her painting instructors at the time, Ilya Bolotowski, said, I don't know what's happened to Ruth. She was a painter and now she's a sculptor. She wants to weave wire, or she wants to actually loop these wire, they called them baskets at the time, because they weren't really clued into the fact that this wasn't going to be some utilitarian craft. It was going to be fine art. By the time she was planning her first home with Albert in a loft in the produce district over an onion warehouse, she knew she wanted to weave wire. She said, all I want, in one of her wonderful love letters, all I want is one big room with space to see the people I love and a place to weave wire. And these hands that have been, this life that had been bruised by racism through the war, would only accept the cuts from looping wire. And she kind of laid out her manifesto in a love letter. It was extraordinary. So they made their studio life together. And Albert would go off to his architectural offices in the daytime, and she would loop wire or paint in the studio at night.
And this studio that they had was their home in San Francisco, and it had this sort of parade of people kind of coming and going, and so much of her work was collaborative. And she really seemed to be the sort of person that people were drawn to.
That's very true. They outgrew their when they were expecting their first baby. To go back to the 6 children piece, they were expecting their first baby, who was due to arrive in June of 1949. But Ruth was so eager to jumpstart this large family she wanted, that she craved. She did something extraordinary. With her baby due in something like 6 weeks, she and Albert adopted a newborn baby boy whose mother was unable to keep him. And so Xavier Lanier came into her arms and her life literally weeks before she gave birth to her first daughter, Aiko. So she thought 2 were as easy as 1. And when, as a new mother, her milk came in, she nursed them both. And she worked in the studio. Eventually, they had a series of little houses throughout the city, McCormick Place and up in Twin Peaks. And then finally, they found the home of their lifetime, which was in Noe Valley, a brown shingled wood house that looked like, according to Harry Parker, the former head of the San Francisco Fine Arts Museums, he said it looked like a miner's cabin from the outside and a cathedral from within, because it had tall beamed ceilings from which she would hang her sculptures. And yes, there was a parade of creative people in and out of the house, along with growing numbers of children sort of rampaging through. She would have her artist friends playwrights, poets, sculptors, her collaborators. She did have a studio, an active studio, and studio partners. So she worked with her studio partner, Nancy Thompson, as well as her neighbor and studio partner, May Lee. She also really invited in certain works, not the looped wire sculptures, those were by her hands alone, no tools, just her hands. But on some of the bas-relief fountains, sculpted fountains, some of those were collaborative works by design. So for those of you who have been lucky enough to see the Hyatt Union Square fountain, which is a large cylindrical bronze cast bas-relief of San Francisco cityscapes, she wanted specifically many hands doing the work. She liked the texture of many hands. So friends, fellow artists, family members, her mother came and would work on trees and grasses. She invited neighborhood children. People I know who are adults now, friends from her past, said that when they were children, they were invited to sculpt a little tiny figure that went into the fountain. Also, the Santa Rosa Courthouse Square fountain was specifically designed as a vehicle for children. So she invited the children of Santa Rosa Public Schools to create sea life. So a sand shark or a salmon or an octopus. And she took them all to the aquarium so they could sketch from life. And then she taught them how to mold the figures in baker's clay, which she created for her own children's amusement, but then which became an actual model medium for works that would later be cast in bronze or in some other material. So yes, she loved collaboration, and she always, always gave credit. So you'll see on some of her sculpted fountains, the names not only of fellow artists who had a hand, but the names of the concrete company that cast the base, or the bronze foundry that cast the pieces of bronze. Anyone whose hands touched the work got credit from her. And it's said that on one day when she went to Santa Rosa to dedicate a sculptured fountain, she spent her time not receiving the accolades of the community, but going around and personally thanking every workman who had pulled and placed pieces of the fountain that day. So she was very egalitarian and very democratic in the way that she worked and lived.
I love that. I also love that you included the actual recipe for the baker's clay in the book, as I have a 10-year-old home during a pandemic, and I have like literally just run out of any ideas of what to do with him anymore. I'm like, flour, water, salt, I can do this. So, and what I think was also so fascinating about your book, and what you often, don't come across when you see a work of public art, or even when you're walking through a museum, is all of the different stages that go into the production of this art. And so, as you were writing about the foundry where they pour the bronze around these sculptures, or how she and her son were trying to figure out how to keep the baker's clay from cracking in the humidity in Oakland, it really transports you sort of to that time and place, and makes you truly understand her process. And it makes me think of when she was talking about working with kids in schools, and when she began the Alvarado Street project, how important it was to involve children and to get the materials into their hands, and have them really learn how to manipulate that. And so for those of maybe you could talk a little bit about her work with the schools in San Francisco, and how that led to what she later called her seventh child.
Right. Well, it all began when her children started entering the public school system, and what passed for art in the classrooms of harried, overworked, overburdened teachers was frequently the mimeographed sheets. Now they would sort of do Xeroxes or something of the sort, but back in the 50s and the early 60s, they would produce these mimeographed sheets that would have purple outlines of a turkey at Thanksgiving, or of a bunny rabbit in the springtime. And students could color in the lines. And she was, of course, aghast at this. She was appalled. Even in her little Norwalk, California elementary school, she learned from artists who were encouraging her at the tender age of 8 to make an abstract drawing. And she felt sure that the schools could do better. Even a school system that was strapped for funds could do much, much better. So she banded together a group of parents, active parents in her neighborhood in Noe Valley around the Alvarado Street School. And she got them to volunteer their time and collect materials. And it began first as a summer project. So they offered a summer art and craft program for some weeks in the summertime. And they got donated materials in order to provide for the students. They cadged materials wherever they could, excess paper, surplus fabric. They collected egg cartons and milk cartons, anything they could get their hands on. It became popular, and it spread first to a second school and then a third school. Finally, she approached the school board, the Board of Education, and said, we would like to expand this to a year-round program, and we have people to enter the schools and to volunteer their time, and will you give us the money? Eventually, after years of campaigning, she became a line item on the San Francisco Unified Public School budget, which was a great breakthrough. She garnered foundation support. She got the attention of the National Education Association, which praised her work for, they said, building San Francisco into a city of gold with Alvarado Arts. And then, of course, her pièce de résistance was the Ruth Asawa High School of the Arts. It was not named for her originally. And in fact, she resisted that somewhat, but that is what it's called today. And it is standing high on a hill, not far from where I live. It's just up there. You can see it. Someday it maybe move downtown, which was her dream. She dreamed that the High School of the Arts, the Ruth Asawa School of the Arts, would one day take its place in Civic Center near all of the great art institutions, the symphony, the ballet, the opera, the great museums. She dreamed that her students would be able to walk to a dress rehearsal of the opera, or a rehearsal of the San Francisco Symphony, or be able to observe prima ballerinas and dancers at their work. She helped raise $150 million in bond funds. They just couldn't make it happen. But there are those in the city today who believe that one day it will happen. And there's a spot right at the corner of about Van Ness and Market Street, where they picked out the building. Albert designed the seismic retrofits. And all they need to do is raise another $150 million. That's all.
You know.
Small potatoes. Maybe some wonderful philanthropist in Silicon Valley can come up with the cash.
Yes, I was going to say, as some of these companies are moving to work from home more permanently, this might open up an opportunity. I wanted to share a question from Robin, who's here, and you know, we've talked about the importance of family to Ruth, and she said, can you speak to the reunion with her father when they were interned, or after they were interned? The letters that they wrote to try to get her father reunited with her siblings were very touching.
I was really also moved and, in fact, blown away by Ruth's not only maturity, but her poise and determination. She actually began writing letters for her father's release while she was still at Santa Anita Racetrack, living in a horse stall. So the way that it happened was her father was whisked away. He was literally picked up by 2 FBI agents while he was tending his strawberry plants. He was on his knees tending his strawberry plants when 2 FBI agents arrived at the farm. This was just a few months after Pearl Harbor. It was probably a matter of weeks after President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing the roundup and incarceration of Japanese American citizens from the West Coast. So that would be Washington, Oregon, coastal California, and Arizona, into 10 or 11 main, I guess 10 main relocation centers, as they were euphemistically called. But Ruth's father didn't go with the rest of the family to Arkansas. In fact, he was picked up and whisked away in February by the FBI to an undisclosed location. He was interrogated while still in the Los Angeles area, and eventually was imprisoned in Lordsburg, New Mexico, in a camp for what they called alien enemies. And the reason that Mr. Asawa, who was a 60-year-old farmer who had been in this country tilling the land for 40 years, growing food as a productive truck farmer, the reason that you will not believe this, but if you haven't read the book, the reason that he drew the attention of the FBI as a potential enemy alien was two things. He was a productive farmer, and productive farmers of Japanese American extraction drew the envy of the white farmer groups. And secondly, because he sent his children to kendo fencing classes. And kendo fencing, the art of Japanese traditional kendo, was thought by the FBI to be somehow tangentially linked with paramilitary groups in Japan. There was a group called the Black Dragon Society. So I have actually obtained and read the FBI report on Mr. Asawa. And they said, this gentleman is being very evasive. He didn't admit that he paid for the fencing lessons, but under intensive interrogation, he finally admitted that he gave his wife the money, and she paid for the lessons, and his children were given kendo lessons. So he was a productive farmer, a leader in the community, in the agricultural industry, and he had taught had paid for kendo lessons, and also seen to it that his children went to Japanese school on Saturday, and that alone made him suspect. So the family was absolutely stricken the day that he was arrested and taken away. They didn't know where he was. Ruth found out the names of the attorneys general in the LA area, and the people that were in charge of tracking those who were incarcerated. She started a campaign of letter writing in which she also engaged her brother and her mother. And she would write these very poised, very persuasive letters. Dear sir, I am appealing to you because my family needs our father's leadership and his tender care, and I'm worried about his health. We don't know where he is. Will you please allow him at least to join us? And so she kept up this campaign of letter writing, and she didn't remain in Arkansas long enough to see him join the family, but eventually he did. And one extraordinary coincidence, I feel, is that one of the attorneys in the Justice Department that she wrote to get her father out of the harsh camp in New Mexico, they were all harsh, but this was harsher, eventually gave up his post at the Justice Department and went to work for the ACLU and helped the ACLU bring cases to help the resistors who stood up to the incarceration. So Ruth's letters may have had a profound effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible, an incredible testament to, just her determination and her drive, and her sense of, of agency in really having something that she believes in and going after it, no matter the obstacles. And I think that it really, that is a theme that comes up again and again, even later in her life when she's struggling with lupus and she's still working, and and sort of, it's really remarkable all that this woman accomplished. And we are so lucky to have her work to be able to enjoy. And I'm curious, just, do you feel like Ruth Asawa, her star is still rising? Do you think that that there is still more story to be written?
I really do. I really do. I'm afraid that there was one little bit of Laura's last question that if I can just have a second.
Oh, of course.
Her reunion with her mother and father came after the war. She had already gone on to Black Mountain, and her parents were given the standard $25 and a bus ticket to remake their life. They lost everything, all the farm equipment, all the goodwill, business relationships. So they became farm laborers at the age of 50 and 65 or something like that, 53 and 65. Saved their money, went back to LA and started a farm stand by the roadside. And Ruth left Black Mountain for a period of months to help them out. So she did have that delayed reunion with Mama and Papa in LA, helping them reestablish a small farm stand. But yes, we are incredibly fortunate to have in this city of San Francisco a wealth of Asawa sculptures. Her work is growing in, I think, knowledge, and the knowledge of the art loving and the art buying public. Although she did show work for a time in New York when she's very young, and a young sculptor in the late 50s, she ended that relationship to really focus on her San Francisco studio. And when that happened, New York art buying and viewing public kind of forgot about her. She had made a great splash and had reviews in Time magazine when she was very young. And when she confined her activities to San Francisco, this city, of course, knew her and loved her and appreciated her. New York reviewers tended to, even as they were delivering a compliment for an exhibition, tended to use words like small and feminine and graceful and sort of craftswoman-like. And she would be called, Mrs. Lanier, the architect's wife and mother of 6, has produced a lovely, graceful show of her wire baskets or something like that. They treated her like a utilitarian craftswoman, and also there was this tendency to exoticize her work. Over the decades, I think people have learned to appreciate just how revolutionary her style of sculpture is. They didn't know what to make of it at first. It was suspended from the ceiling instead of being anchored to the ground like a Henry Moore, or a David Smith, or even an Alexander Calder. Those have motion, but they're still, in some cases, there are the mobiles, but there also are pieces from the ground. So people didn't know what to make of these sort of ethereal looped wire suspensions, really. Now, I think, since the relaunch of Ruth's career by Jonathan Laib, first from Christie's and now with the David Zwirner Gallery, he came to know Ruth's work through very interesting coincidence, which I won't be a spoiler about because I'd love for you to read the story in the book. But it's actually a sort of beautiful, poetic closing of the circle between Albers and Ruth and the family. Jonathan Laib was very astute, and he saw in a flash, once he saw her work, that her work had been neglected. And he determined that he was going to see to it that this misapprehension or neglect of this genius was going to be corrected. So first he began with a very selective auction of a few works at Christie's. And when he moved to the David Zwirner Gallery, he took her estate with him and began showing her work there. Ruth Asawa passed away in the summer of 2013. She just lived long enough to learn that her work had broken through the stratosphere into the $1 million plus mark. Since that time, I will tell you, and this is public knowledge, so I'm not breaking any secrets, there have been auctions where her work has gone for 4 times that amount. So collectors and museums and galleries are really understanding her, I think, at a whole new level.
That's so wonderful.
It continues.
Excited to see. Wanting to get one last question quickly. You had mentioned, and this comes from someone else who's here, Mia, you had mentioned her engaging with Disney animators in Santa Anita, and Mia was just curious a bit more about how you found that those animators, specifically Chris Ishii, taught her there.
Well, Ruth herself wrote, we're lucky to have in her archives, in her writings, some incredibly beautiful, revealing sort of memoir style writing that she did when she was confined to bed with lupus. She got a bunch of yellow legal pads and just started writing because she was sleepless from the medication. And she wrote that in the midst of the squalor of being confined to a horse stall in Santa Anita, one day there was this magical event. She was attending classes and she learned that there were 3 animators from Disney Studios who were Japanese American who were sent to Santa Anita. And they offered to teach the students drawing and perspective, and they had brought real artist's paper and they had brought charcoal. And so they sat in the grandstand and they generously gave of their time teaching these young students how to draw and how to achieve perspective in their drawing. Also, they were incredible heroes because as Disney animators, they had worked on some of the very famous feature films, full-length animated feature films like Dumbo and Snow White and perhaps Fantasia and other films. So Ruth, who had been an avid cartoonist as a young child, was, of course, completely smitten and also, I think, moved by their generosity. And that was the beginning of her conviction that the best way for young artists to learn is by observing working artists. Also, I think it's not trivial that they looked like her. They looked like her siblings. They looked like all the parents and the children, the thousands of people who were unjustly rounded up and gathered into these inhumane conditions. So it must have been an enormous boost to their spirits to see these very, very gifted artists.
I mean, it is an amazing trove of treasures that really exist. Both all of the documents, the artwork, and now her story. And I know that you have worked really closely with the family and the Asawa Foundation to help sort of gather all of this material to be able to share it with us. And we are so grateful for to you for coming and chatting with us and sharing the book. And I hope that everybody who has joined us this evening has enjoyed hearing from Marilyn and learning about Ruth's work and maybe discovering something new. I mean, I know I certainly learned a lot. We would encourage you to please call up your local independent bookstore if you have not had a chance to purchase the book yet. You can also buy it directly from Chronicle Books. And we want to thank Chronicle Books for helping us make this event happen. And I did not get a chance to ask you about the Barbary Plague, so I am just going to have to catch you on another chat, Marilyn. We're going to have to invite you back because there's just too many very creepy parallels between what happened in 1900 to 1906 and what we're going through now. So I would be dying to get inside of your head right now.
Well, it is an eerie, there are a lot of eerie parallels, but to end on a higher note, a sort of high rather than a low, I think Ruth's story of overcoming sort of the scapegoating of the World War II era and all of the adversity she faced is kind of a model for perhaps how we can summon our better angels and strengthen ourselves for what we have to go through. In fact, I was talking to Ruth's youngest son, Paul, and I said, you know, Paul, sheltering in place is really strange, but I have to say that thinking back on what your mother endured and transcended in her lifetime has really strengthened me for the months to come. And it's really true.
Indeed. We couldn't say it better. We will leave it at that. Marilyn, thank you so much. Please come back and chat with us again. And thanks to everybody for coming out. You can find upcoming events on our website at silentbook.club. And we hope to see you all again soon. So take care, everybody.
Thanks so much.